When we think of medieval food, we picture roasted meat, hard bread, and endless ale. But what actually fed entire villages were plants you've probably never heard of. Some were more nutritious than rice, grew in poor soil, and saved generations from starvation. The strange part? Most of them have vanished from farms and from memory. In this video, you'll discover 15 forgotten crops that once sustained the medieval world. And at the end, a nearly magical plant that's making a comeback and might just be food for the future. The grains that came before wheat. Before wheat became the undisputed king of European agriculture, other grains quietly fed entire medieval villages. Not because they were less nutritious, but because they were tougher, more accessible, and far less demanding on the land. 1. Spelt. Often called the poor man's wheat, this ancient grain is now considered a superfood in health stores. In medieval times, it served as a rustic alternative to common wheat. It grew well in poor soil, handled unpredictable weather, and had a natural resistance to pests thanks to its tough outer husk. It wasn't easy to process, but it was highly valued. Spelt was used to make dark bread, thick porridge, and even rustic beer. It was rich in fiber and protein, ideal for keeping peasants full for long workdays. Fun fact, archaeologists have discovered spelt preserved in burnt grain stores from the 11th century, showing how carefully it was stored, almost like a food treasure. Now nearly forgotten, millet was one of the most important crops in times of scarcity. It grows fast, needs very little water, and handles heat better than most grains, making it essential in drier regions of medieval Europe. Its neutral taste and soft texture made it perfect for porridge, griddle cakes, and even medieval pancakes. It was also used as animal feed, adding to its value as a multi-use crop. Today, millet is making a quiet comeback as a functional food, gluten-free and popular in anti-inflammatory diets. 3. Gehald, barley. Medieval barley wasn't like the pearled kind used in modern craft beers. It still had its outer husk, was rougher, and took longer to cook. But none of that mattered. It was one of the core staples of peasant diets. Barley was used in thick soups, savory porridges, and dense breads. It was prized for withstanding harsh cold and producing high yields per acre. Even unground, it could be simmered for hours into a soft, nutrient-rich mush. In times of war or failed harvests, barley was the silent savior, feeding entire villages with quiet resilience. These 3 grains weren't just food, they were symbols of independence. While wheat was tied to cities and wealth, spelt, millet, and barley were grown, harvested, and consumed locally, with techniques passed from parent to child. Today, while wheat fills store shelves, these ancient grains are being rediscovered by nutritionists, chefs, and regenerative farmers. But back then, they weren't trendy, they were essential. And in a world facing soil exhaustion and climate disruption, maybe it's time to learn from the crops that fed the past and might just feed our future. The greens that grew from the ground, not the market. Before supermarkets, planned farming, or grocery lists, medieval peasants turned to something much older and more reliable: the wild greens that grew at their feet. These weren't cultivated crops with rows and fences. They were freely growing, often ignored plants that became essential for survival, especially in the lean seasons. They were picked from hedgerows, field edges, forest clearings, and even roadsides. The ability to recognize, gather, and prepare them was a life-saving skill, passed down through generations, often through the hands of women, grandmothers, and healers. 4. Wild chard. Known for its large, dark leaves and tough resilience, wild chard was a cornerstone of the peasant diet. It grew quickly in poor soils, withstood cold and drought, and didn't need to be replanted each year. The leaves were boiled, sautéed, or chopped into stews, often mixed with grains or beans for bulk. What made wild chard so valuable wasn't just its availability, but its nutritional weight. Rich in iron, calcium, magnesium, and vitamins A and K, it helped counteract deficiencies in diets heavy on grain and low on variety. It didn't just fill stomachs, it strengthened bodies. 5. Sorrel. This tangy, citrus-flavored leaf added brightness to an otherwise bland medieval diet. It was used to flavor soups and potages, or brewed into infusions to clean the blood, as medieval herbalists put it. Its high vitamin C content made it critical during long winters, when scurvy was a real risk. More than just a side dish, sorrel was a healing plant. It was believed to reduce fevers, aid digestion, and cool internal heat in the humoral system of medieval medicine. In many ways, it was both food and pharmacy, used not just to nourish but to restore balance. 6. Black mustard greens. Fast-growing and pungent, black mustard was both a food and a remedy. Its young leaves added a peppery bite to meals and were often mixed with fatty cuts or beans to balance flavor. The seeds, when collected and crushed, formed the base of an early condiment, but also a treatment. Heated mustard poultices were applied to sore muscles and congested chests, believed to draw out illness. In folk medicine, the entire plant was considered stimulating and purifying. Even its presence along footpaths and fences made it a kind of quiet companion to daily rural life. For medieval peasants, these plants weren't just background flora. They were a kind of social safety net, accessible even to the landless. They didn't require ownership, only knowledge and timing. And that knowledge created resilience, especially in times of hunger, war, or disease. In modern times, many of these greens are dismissed as weeds, or at best, curiosities. But their return in herbalism, permaculture, and even fine dining shows a deeper truth. These were not scraps from the earth. They were gifts, forgotten not because they failed, but because we stopped noticing them. They grew uninvited, and still do. The only question is whether we remember how to recognize their value before we need them again. The legumes that save the winter. When winter hit and fresh greens vanished, medieval peasants turned to something far more durable: legumes. These weren't side dishes. They were survival food, rich in protein, easy to dry, and capable of lasting through the harshest seasons without rotting. Unlike grains, legumes fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching the land for future planting. This made them critical not only to the body, but to the ecology of medieval agriculture. They fed people, animals, and the earth itself. 7. Broad beans. Also called fava beans, broad beans were a staple in medieval fields and kitchens. They were easy to grow, high in calories, and packed with protein and fiber, something rare in a diet without regular meat. Peasants dried them for winter storage, cooked them in stews, mashed them into spreads, or ate them boiled with greens. But broad beans also had a dark side. A small portion of the population suffered from favism, a genetic condition that causes a reaction to fava beans. This wasn't understood at the time, but the mystery of sudden illness after eating beans added to the mythology surrounding them. 8. Lupins. Today seen as ornamental flowers, lupins were once cultivated as food. In medieval Europe, people grew a bitter variety that needed to be soaked and boiled repeatedly to remove toxins. But when prepared correctly, they were extremely nutritious. Rich in protein, energy-dense, and useful as both human and animal feed, lupins were a valuable backup crop during food shortages. They weren't glamorous, but in years of failed grain harvests, they kept people alive. And, like other legumes, they improved the soil, meaning fields that grew lupins one year were better prepared for cereals the next. 9. Field peas. Unlike the sweet varieties we know today, these peas were dense, earthy, and built for storage. Eaten dried, crushed into flour, or rehydrated in pottage, they were one of the most common sources of daily calories for peasants across Europe. Monasteries often relied on field peas during Lent or fasting periods, making them an essential part of both peasant and monastic diets. In many regions, field peas were planted alongside grains in mixed plots, a technique that maximized land use and mimicked modern intercropping. These legumes weren't glamorous, but they were deeply reliable. They could withstand poor weather, grow in depleted soil, and still yield enough to feed families through dark, frozen months. In an age before freezers or global trade, legumes weren't a side dish. They were the winter pantry. The roots that grew even in scarcity. When the ground froze and fields went barren, what fed medieval peasants wasn't what grew above the soil, but what survived beneath it. Root vegetables were the hidden insurance policy of the Middle Ages. They required little care, stored well in cellars, and could be harvested long after the surface crops had failed. These weren't side dishes, they were main courses, thrown into pots, roasted in coals, or boiled down into thick, earthy mash. And while they didn't offer excitement, they offered certainty. In an age ruled by uncertainty, that mattered more than flavor. 10. Parsnip. Before the arrival of the potato from the Americas, parsnips were the starch of choice. Creamy, sweet when roasted, and surprisingly filling, parsnips were easy to grow and even easier to store. They stayed edible for months, especially when buried in cool sand or soil. Medieval cooks mashed them like potatoes, sliced them into stews, or roasted them in fire pits. They were also used to make sweet ale-like drinks, as their natural sugars fermented easily. For peasants, this made parsnips a 2-for-1: food and drink. 11. Wild turnip. Hardy, rugged, and often far from delicious, this root was a staple in times of scarcity. Bitter and fibrous, it needed long cooking times to become palatable. But it thrived in poor soil, matured quickly, and fed people when nothing else would. In times of famine, even the tops of the plant were used. Turnip greens boiled with salt or animal fat became a staple soup base. The root itself was boiled, mashed, or dried and ground into coarse flour. While nobility viewed turnips as animal feed, for peasants they were essential, cheap, dependable, and always available, even if not exactly welcome. 12. Root chicory. Best known today as a coffee substitute, this bitter, earthy root once served a dual role in medieval Europe, as both food and medicine. It was boiled and mixed with other roots to stretch meals or add flavor depth to otherwise bland porridges. It was also dried, roasted, and used as a coffee substitute centuries before real coffee arrived. But more than that, chicory was known as a cleansing plant in medieval herbalism. Healers used it to treat liver problems, sluggish digestion, and skin conditions. Chicory didn't just feed the body, it was believed to purify it. Roots like these weren't exciting, but they were adaptable. They handled poor soil, frost, drought, and neglect. They could be stored in cellars, buried in pits, or dried and powdered for later use. They were the quiet workers of the medieval diet, and while we might overlook them today, they carried generations through some of the harshest years in European history. When nothing else would grow, these roots didn't just survive, they delivered. The plants that healed and nourished. In a world without pharmacies, medieval peasants relied on what they could gather, boil, crush, or steep. Many of the plants that fed them also healed them, because when you couldn't afford to separate the kitchen from the medicine chest, everything had to do both. These plants were added to stews, turned into poultices, brewed into teas, and hung to dry above cooking fires. They were survival tools, nourishing the body and treating everything from indigestion to infection. 13. Wild leek. Sharp in scent, rich in sulfur, and packed with micronutrients, wild leek was a powerful ingredient in medieval diets. It added flavor to stews, bulk to bread, and strength to sick bodies. It was often used in spring tonics after long winters with little green food, helping cleanse the blood and boost energy. More importantly, it grew early, before most other plants returned, making it one of the first signs that winter was finally losing its grip. To the medieval peasant, wild leek meant life was about to begin again. 14. Caraway. Used as both spice and remedy, these seeds were sprinkled into dense breads, added to cheese, and used to season root vegetables. But more than flavor, they brought digestive relief. Medieval people believed caraway warmed the stomach and prevented bloating, especially important in diets heavy on starch and low on fiber. Caraway was also thought to protect against evil and was used in charms, potions, and even sewn into children's clothes. It wasn't just part of the meal, it was part of the culture. 15. Nettle. Often dismissed today as a stinging weed, this plant was once an essential food and medicine in medieval Europe. When cooked, its sting disappeared, and it became a rich source of iron, calcium, and vitamin C, exactly what people needed after long, lean winters. It was boiled into soups, pressed into cakes, or brewed into a light, detoxifying tea. For pregnant women, the sick, and the elderly, nettle was considered restorative, a green revival for tired bodies. Healers also used it externally to treat wounds, inflammation, and even arthritis through urtication, the deliberate whipping of skin with nettle to stimulate circulation. For the medieval peasant, these plants were more than ingredients. They were memory, tradition, and survival instinct passed through generations. They reminded people that healing and nourishment could come from the same leaf. And today, these same plants are reappearing in herbal medicine, regenerative farming, and high-end cuisine. What was once dismissed as peasant food is now revered as functional, wild, and wise. Because sometimes the best nutrition doesn't come from a package. It grows by the road, stings when touched, and still waits, quietly, to be remembered. The one plant that might feed the future. For thousands of years, these crops weren't forgotten. They were trusted. They sustained families, healed wounds, restored strength, and anchored communities. But as agriculture became industrial, uniform, and globalized, many of these plants simply disappeared. Not because they failed, but because they didn't fit the system. And yet, one of them is quietly returning: nettle. Yes, the same stinging plant that once lined muddy paths and grew behind stone cottages is now being studied for its nutritional density, soil regeneration ability, and resilience in harsh climates. Nettle requires no fertilizer, thrives in poor soils, and contains more iron than spinach, more calcium than milk, and more vitamin C than oranges. It's being used in regenerative farming, foraged by chefs in Michelin-starred kitchens, and brewed in herbalist clinics across Europe. From medieval peasant soup to future protein supplement, nettle might be the perfect symbol of what we lost and what we need to reclaim. Because food isn't just about calories. It's about culture, ecology, resilience. And as we face a century of climate shocks, soil degradation, and supply chain instability, we may need to look back at the people who could feed themselves with nothing but a patch of earth, a handful of seed, and a knowledge of what the wild could offer. Maybe the future of food isn't high-tech. Maybe it's high memory.
The question is,
will we wait for another crisis to rediscover what the peasants never forgot?